My name is Martin Gill, and a very warm welcome to our 29th Security Thought Leadership webinar. Every Tuesday and Thursday throughout lockdown, we've been here, and we will continue to be here every Tuesday and Thursday throughout July. And the idea of thought leadership is to critique what is going on today in order we may have a better type of provision in the future. And our topic today is about if policing is too important to be left to the police, what is the role of private security? And those of you who have attended previous webinars will know that this is a point of controversy. On the one hand, we have the enormity of what the private security does, and then on the other hand, we have the reality that where relationships are good between policing and private security, it is most often in pockets. It's not a universal approach. I have four panelists with me today from different parts of the world. Two have a career in policing and have gone into private security. One is a security professional throughout his career, up to senior management. And the other one is the world's leading academic who has inspired thinking around the world in policing and in particular its relationship with private security. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves. And once each of them have done that, I will then invite them to make their opening statements. After they've done their opening statements, I'll then come to you, the audience, and ask you if you've got any questions you'd like to put them. Please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. Get them in early. This is going to be action-packed. Right then, let's meet our panel, and let's go to South Africa first and meet Dave. Dave, introduce yourself, please.
Good afternoon, Martin. Yes, Dave Dodge. I was police officer in London for 30 years, retired as a detective chief inspector, moved to South Africa, much better weather, although a lot more crime. I've been here now for 12 years. I'm an independent consultant. I'm also a member of ASAS International and their Professional Standards Board, which do standards and guidelines for worldwide for security. I also do a lot of ISO training for management systems, particularly in terms of business continuity, information security, cyber security, that sort of thing.
Thank you very much indeed, Dave. Stephen.
Good afternoon, Martin, and everybody who's connecting in from the rest of the world. I hope you're all well and safe. My name is Steve Gardner. I'm head of security at OCS Group. We're an international company providing security services and solutions from the UK, across Asia, and in Australia and New Zealand. I've been actively involved in electronic security and manned guarding since 1993, working with UK and international companies, reviewing security methodologies and developing appropriate solutions. A regular contributor to Martin's Thought Leadership panel and a passionate believer in the people plus model. That's people plus the technology is definitely the future of security.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. Indeed, you've been a major contributor to Thought Leadership. Chris Phillips, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Chris Phillips. I was a police officer in London for 30 years and did lots of work there around ranging from counter-terrorism, but also in particular public order and specifically public order around sports events. Stadiums were my thing. After 9/11, I became much more interested in counter-terrorism, and from 9/11, really, I became more and more involved in that and ended up as the head of the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office, which is a unit based within MI5. It's a police team based within MI5, designed to give security advice for businesses. And since retiring 9 years ago, I've been doing exactly that, working with businesses on counter-terrorism issues, but also on crisis management.
Thank you very much indeed. And finally, Professor Philip Stenning.
Good afternoon, if that's your time of day. I'm a retired academic. I've held senior academic positions in Canada, Australia, the UK, New Zealand, and more recently, South Africa. I've been doing research and writing on private security for almost 50 years now. But my position on it has changed a lot during the last 30 years, and I'll be talking about that when my turn comes. The only other thing I can say about myself is that I have a reputation for stirring pots.
You very definitely do, and that's why you're here, Philip. So let's go to our opening statements then. Don't forget your question and answer button at the bottom of your screen for questions from the audience. Dave, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, differences across the world between policing models, and I think recently We've seen a lot of difference in the US as much as anything with the UK. South Africa and Africa is particularly different. We're talking about crimes on a totally different scale. And if I give you some statistics here, and I'll try and keep them brief, murders last year in South Africa, 21,022. That's 58 a day. So that gives you some of the ideas of the volume of work. And we don't have that many more police officers, I don't think, than the UK does. But private security, therefore, take over. And I think there's a couple of 100,000 police officers. There are at least, well, varying figures, probably about 500,000 private security guards that are registered. Well, there are 2 million registered, probably about 500,000 that are actually active. Last year, 60 of those were killed, about 60 were killed during their line of duty. About 30 police officers were killed during their line of duty. So the difference between private security and police there, they seem to take up similar roles, but very different to the UK. The average police constable in South Africa is paid £8,000 a year. I've converted everything to pounds, that's current figures. A security guard in South Africa gets £200 a month. So the expectation there in terms of abilities and competence is going to be very clear that it's a bit of an issue. Realistically, I would say one thing, police and public partnership, here you've got two groups of people that are hugely apart in the volume. We're talking constable level and private security guards. So they are hugely different from hugely different backgrounds. So that is a bit of an issue. The police are variably considered in terms of their professionalism. But if you think of some headline figures, apparently only 1 in 9 rapes are ever reported. And a lot of those are not reported because of concerns over the way that the police will deal with them. And I know at least 2 victims personally who were raped and would not give their details to police, and they would not go and report it. So you've got huge problems on the policing side, but you've got equally huge problems on the private security side because they are also fairly heavily involved in crime, some would say. And I've known examples of that when I've done investigations here. So there's a huge problem, and it's very different to the UK. But I think one thing they don't do here is actually work together. But you have to bear in mind that the volume of private security, they are almost certainly going to be the first responder. They are the first people on the scene of a crime. If I were to press the alarm here now, I would almost guarantee I will get my local community police forum response team, armed response team here well before the police. So there's a bit of an issue now about actually response in terms of the actual abilities and the capabilities of the police and private security in South Africa.
Dave, thank you very much indeed. Interesting points. Let's go now to Stephen Gardner. Stephen, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Martin. As the head of security of a private security company, you'd expect my perspective to be slightly different to Dave's. And obviously, we need to work in a much more collaborative manner. There are some great schemes in the UK, like CSAS, the Community Safety Accreditation Scheme, and security environments. But not all police forces acknowledge them. When we get this unified approach, I believe we can start to develop a real partnership. The schemes demonstrate the benefits commercial clients are keen to drag out of private security companies. Having said that, I believe that the relationship between the police and private security companies has come a long, long way in a short space of time. We as private security companies continually learn from police forces, and the increased communication between the police and their communication outlets into private security companies demonstrates a willingness on both sides. Let's say here and now that the private security industry has largely accepted poor training of officers in the past. The SIA license training has often been seen as training when in reality it's been no more than a route into the industry. However, companies are now recognizing that without training, officers will just be men and ladies standing on doors. What we want are complete and utter training programs, developing security officers into professionals. It's the way the industry is going to develop its professionalism. GDPR is also an area that we need to address. Currently, we find ourselves not able to share with the police some of the CCTV footage, as no data sharing agreement exists with either the local police or a retail crime initiative. Pre-COVID and pre-GDPR, those demands were the norm. This has now adjusted into something completely different. Because of the restrictions of many people having to work from home, our contact subsequently with the police has diminished and become slightly fragmented. This, of course, is the same in a different situation. I'm a big supporter of Project Servitor. I believe it was the beginning of showing the public that we do work in partnership. But again, some forces support this initiative, whilst others, with due to financial constraints, have had their finances removed. Greater promotion of the success of antisocial behaviour and retail crime has to be a starting point. This is where those who commit a crime will know that we will share information with police forces, and those individuals will find themselves very easily tracked down and traced. The optimal relationship between the police and private security is that we stand ready and willing to offer our services where required. What we do and the lengths we go to make it work should be the subject, Martin, of some much further discussion. As we progress into the new norm, what it will look like, say, at Christmas or even beyond, will depend on the communication between both parties. Thank you.
Steve, thank you very much indeed. So one panelist pointing out the good and one post pointing out the problems. Let's go to Chris Phillips. Your opening statement, please, Chris.
Yes, hopefully I'll be quite brief on this. What I would say is that policing across the world is in serious difficulties. It's got problems like it's never had before. Even governments now are unable to control their populations. We've got a threat level that is not only around terrorism, but around all aspects of crime that is more diverse, more complicated than it's ever been before. Police forces around the world are unable to cope. There's no doubt about that. And the populations are, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, revolting against the police services that are there to protect them. They don't see them as a protection. Many in the community see them as the problem. Now, what I'd say is it's the threats, the range of threats that we've seen around, just taking terrorism as an example, where individual groups of people were able to previously operate. Now they're able to operate across the world. Likewise with organized crime gangs, likewise with drug trafficking rings, etc. This is now becoming a worldwide problem. They don't recognize borders. And of course, policing generally does have borders and are unable to deal with things across continents, across countries. These are the issues that policing have, and the policing models that exist across the world are all very different, but all trying essentially to do the same thing. But the trouble is the populations are becoming much more difficult to control. And that is largely caused by the internet, largely caused by social media. If you think back to the Arab Spring, none of that would have been possible had it not been for social media, with groups of people able to bring themselves together to overthrow governments that have been in power for many years beforehand. What is essentially the case is now that the police will not be able to cope in the future. We have a situation where even in the UK, where we like to think we do things quite well, no one can rely on crime figures. No one really knows how much crime is happening across our country and other countries. So what's the way forward? Well, I don't think we know yet, but I think the only way it can work is by police and security services and the private security companies working together to deal with particular issues. And I'll take cybercrime as an example. Someone in one end of the world can commit a crime in London, and the money from that crime can go somewhere else across the world. So these things are worldwide. The only way that we're ever going to solve them is by integrating policing and the world of private security. But to do that, we've got to professionalize the security guarding and the security companies much more. And that's the only way I can see out of this.
Thank you very much indeed. Some of you are already onto it. Your question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Get your questions in early if you can, and we'll try and come to them. And now our final opening statement, Professor Phillips Denning. Philip, you're on mute. Philip, you're on mute.
As I said, I've been doing research and writing on private security for almost 50 years now, but my position on it has changed a lot during the last 30 years especially. And so what I want to do is try and explain to you what my current views are about private security and the police. Because I now think of myself not as a police or private security scholar, but as a policing scholar. So what do I think about it now? Well, in my view, it's now long past time for discussions about private policing not to be all about relationships between private security, by which most people who talk about it and write about it mean the contract security industry, and the police. That represents late 20th century thinking, which generally conceived of private security as a sort of junior partner of the public police, and promoted the view that the public police are and should be recognized as the institution with primary responsibility for policing provision, and that the role of private security is to provide the policing that the public police either don't want to or can't do, and that it's for the police to decide what that is. Early proponents, of community policing propounded a similar view, that community policing is all about the community helping the police to do policing. And it's not about the community policing itself with the help of the police. And policing provision really is and has been like that. The next thing is that the policing provision involves a vast, in the 21st century, in this century, and in the late 20th century, involved a vast range of public sector and private sector, or government and non-government if you prefer, providers, who sometimes cooperate with each other in providing policing, sometimes don't, and often compete with each other in doing so. And that although the public police are unquestionably one of these policing providers, and an important one, they don't and shouldn't be the ones who determine who does and who doesn't do policing, or the ones who regulate all other policing providers. Policing scholars refer to this modern reality of policing as plural policing provision, and see their task as mapping empirically who are the nodes in this policing web, as the late Canadian policing scholar Jean-Paul Brodeur described it. What policing they provide and in what contexts, and what the relationships between them are. And they should undertake research on this without 20th century preconceptions about who are the most important or dominant nodes in this web of policing provision. So what are the implications for public policy of this view of policing and the roles of the public police and other policing providers? Well, first, the state, as the guardian of the public interest in a liberal democracy such as ours, should have a policing policy rather than just a police policy. And it should have a minister of policing rather than a minister of police. That name doesn't have to change in the UK because we call ours the Home Secretary. And that minister should have responsibility for developing a policing policy. And that policy should embrace the whole array of public sector and private sector policing providers, to which I just alluded. Secondly, the objective of such a policing policy should be to determine what combinations of public and private police providers are best positioned and equipped and qualified to provide policing that best achieves the optimum safety, security, order, and law enforcement in the interests of society as a whole. Policing policy should be supported with a policing budget rather than just a police budget. and that budget should be allocated to policing providers to best achieve the policy's objectives, which I've just described. Police and private security legislation should be replaced with policing legislation, including appropriate arrangements and institutions for governing policing provision. An idea that was propounded notably by the 1999 patent inquiry in Northern Ireland. So this is not a new idea, or not that new. And finally, the focus of reform, to bring this little introduction up to date, should not be on defunding the police, but on determining and funding the best policing provision that can be achieved in the public interest.
Brilliant, thank you very much indeed. As you say, controversial. Well, let's get to some questions. And Paul Ford has hit the nail on the head for me straight away. Stephen, going to come to you first. The trouble with the world of private security, it's all very well saying work together. You can't be trusted, not because you haven't been trained properly, but because you're after profits rather than the public interest first. What would you say?
Well, first and foremost, Martin, I don't think anybody does anything for free these days. So let's clear that one up straight away. Most people either on the panel or listening in will know that the salaries paid to security officers by security companies is not it's not the greatest attractive industry in the world. If you look across a number of companies, and we see regularly companies within the man guarding sector. We heard about a rather large merger last week, and that's simply because the profits just aren't there.
Yes, okay, and I guess I'll come to Chris Phillips just on that issue, Chris. It's all very well saying speak together, but Paul Ford's got a point here, hasn't he? There is this perception, rightly or wrongly, that private security will act in the interest of profit, not in the interest of the public.
Well, absolutely, and of course, everything costs, and the key thing is what you can get. How much bang you can get for your buck, whether you can get more through doing this in a private security manner, or whether you need to do it by paying police officers as we have done in the past. The key thing for me is it's very difficult for police. I mean, if anyone that's been keeping up to date with what's going on in the UK at the moment, they're not able to get the 20,000 extra police officers that Boris has promised, because people aren't willing to join the police at the moment. Yeah. So these things are not as simple and straightforward as you would imagine. But for me, yes, of course, it's private companies are going to be about private, but that doesn't mean to say it can't be good value for money. And there are certain things that the private sector can do really well. And I'm specifically thinking about technological changes that we're getting now, manning areas, whether it's CCTV. We already trust them to do that. And I think these are the sort of areas that need to be expanded. But yes, of course, it does come to money, but policing it's really expensive, and governments aren't willing to spend that money at the moment.
Okay, Chris, thank you. Philip, you want to come in? I'm going to give you a chance here. You're on mute, Philip.
Sorry, I'm muted again. I just wanted to say that I think the question involves a misconception, which I've discovered a long time ago, which is the implication of the question is that the private interest and the public interests are never aligned. This is absolutely not the case. And if I may just quickly give an example of where this is not the case. I did an interview with the security director of Qantas Airlines a couple of years ago. And I raised this question. I said, you know, your security is for the benefit of the profits of Qantas. And he said, his response was interesting, I thought. He said, look, we fly planes with hundreds of people on board. It only takes one good cyber hacker to put our planes are flown by computers, and it only takes one efficient cyber attacker to down one of our planes and kill hundreds of passengers and staff. He said, do you think our interest in not having that plane brought down in the ocean is any different from the government's interest in not having that plane brought down in the ocean? Of course it isn't. We all share the same interests, which is to get those people flown safely from A to B where they're going. So this idea that the interests of the private sector never align with the interests of the public sector is completely wrong in my view.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And an interesting point. We don't hear enough about it in the arguments about private security, by the way. Dave Dodge, I'm going to come to you. And Mike Hurst raises the question about how do we bring then credibility to the role of the private security officer? I mean, you mentioned some of the problems there. And of course, as Philip Senning has said to me in the past, bad practice is not the exclusive preserve of the private sector. But nevertheless, it's the private security officer, the one that lacks the status, lacks the credibility. What's the role of what needs to be done to make that perception and that reality different?
I think the perception and reality have to go with the role. And one of the things here is we're seeing that the private sector security are providing a service which is being paid for, but it's a service that people want. And frequently, policing or police provide a service that many people don't want. I know some people want it, but some people don't. And so it's a case, one of the problems with the changes, and I think Chris alluded to it, the changes over the years with policing, certainly from when I joined, was the fact that we did the good and we did the bad. In terms of we dealt with the problems on the street when people didn't want us to arrest them, but we also went and saw people and interacted with them very positively. And I think the way things are moving is that that's not happening. And the security guards, likewise, they do what the business want to do, which often conflicts with what the public want to do. So I think the whole idea is it's got to be professionalism, which is a word that's been mentioned quite a few times on both sides. But also stop this them and us between private security and the police. They've got to start working together. Stephen mentioned it. Data sharing, information sharing. I think each of us have mentioned it somewhere along the line. There's got to be this continuum. We've got a force continuum we're all used to. There almost has to be, similar to what Philip was saying, a policing continuum. But it's got to be professional. And you have to bear in mind here with COVID, I know, sorry Martin, I know COVID's going to be an issue. During the first couple of weeks of COVID in South Africa, when we had the lockdown, there were more people killed by the law enforcement teams than there were by COVID.
Okay, David, thank you. I'm going to come to Stephen again. Stephen, we're hearing some good things about the possibilities here, and you outlined them in your opening statement. But one of the problems, isn't it, for the private security sector, is people like yourself who are wholly committed and speak and say and act the right sort of language. The problem is generally private security companies can only do what the customer wants. In other words, what the customer will pay for. So no matter how professional you are, if you haven't got a client prepared to back that with funds, aren't you forever on the run? Isn't it really down to convincing clients rather than the security sector about what you can do, what they need to pay for?
I firmly believe that you've heard me talk about the people plus model, people plus technology. I firmly believe that we can educate our clients. We can also work with the police forces with whom we're currently working to demonstrate some of the really good innovations out there, so that we can guide our clients to a better level of private security, and if I can use the word that Philip used, of policing. I firmly believe, certainly in retail, that is very much an opportunity for us to talk to clients and demonstrate to them some of the really, really good things we're doing. You're right, if we can't convince them that that's the right way, then and they will try and force our hand into the way that they want us to police things. I still think that there's an opportunity there for us, as Dave said, to professionalize the industry and demonstrate that professionalism to clients and take them on that, sorry to use the word, but to take them on that journey.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much indeed. Let me come to Philip. Philip, one of the points you mentioned in your opening statement was about the different types of security. What Peter Ashwin, one of the points that Peter Ashwin has made is that already much of the national infrastructure, much of the policing part of broader society is done by the private sector and the private security sector. That in fact, it's misplaced to think of policing in anything other as a predominantly private policing arena. Philip, would you agree? You're on mute, Philip.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I totally agree with that. And if I may just comment on the last question about
Please do.
Professionalization and recognition of the private sector. I think one of the things that needs to happen is the public police have to stop denigrating the private sector in their own interests. I mean, the public police have a strong vested interest in denigrating the private sector. And that's ironic because the leaders of the private sector are mostly, or many of them are former police officers. So if there are problems in the private sector, how come these problems, this sector is being led by former police officers who obviously don't share the same values as the police forces they belong to, right? So I think that's an important aspect. And the other thing is that, you know, the private sector is judged by the lowly security guard. And that's not right. That's like judging the public police by the behavior of the police officer on the street rather than on the overall policing that the police provide. So we need to focus on the policing provision rather than, you know, obviously the qualifications of those who provide them need to be upgraded in both cases. I mean, it's not as if, as you said, it's not as if the public police don't have serious deficiencies, and we've been learning more about those, particularly in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but we've known that for years. So I think we need to try and change the debate so that it ceases to be a competition between the public police and the private security sector for recognition, and becomes focused on, you know, who's in the best position to provide and is best equipped and experienced and trained to provide the best policing in different circumstances and contexts.
Thank you very much indeed. Chris, I'm going to come to you, and a few of the questions, Chris, and there are a lot of them there. Please keep them coming. Use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, please, audience. Chris, a few of the questions are talking about, and it was just mentioned there actually, the lack of respect by the police of the private security sector generally, and of private security companies specifically. And there's no doubt research has shown this to be quite strong. And I guess that therein we have it. We're not even convinced police officers, let alone anyone else, that private security has changed. It's come on a long way. A lot of the questions relate in different ways as to how we change that. Chris?
Well, I think there's a few things here actually that I was going to mention. One is that the financial sector is a great example of the private sector having brilliant investigators who can pick up crime, but of course they find it very difficult to prosecute. Now, I think where the police have got to come in here and say, you know, the police generally don't investigate visa crime as an example, credit card crime. That's a great example where the private sector are almost certainly better than the police at doing that kind of work. But of course, when it gets down to the basic stuff, the man guarding, the guarding stuff, it's basic police work. But of course, just a few years ago, and I remember I'd been in the police when this all kicked off, the police community support officers were effectively brought into police to help the police, but were given pretty much no training at all. Very couple of weeks at Hendon, given some real basic stuff, and then no powers, not almost as many powers as the man in the street. So it can be done. And I think the key to all this is who's going to pay. Can we have, because if it's a private sector paying for police officers to patrol their own estate, or security guards to patrol their own estate, then they're only going to patrol their own estate. Where we need to get to a point is where the government, local authorities, are willing to pay to police, certainly have a community support network within the communities. And if we get that, and everyone gets a reasonable service out of that, then that may well take away some of the excesses required of the police. But this is a long-term thing. You don't gain trust overnight. This is something where working together, building links, actually the private sector getting access to some of the benefits of intelligence that the police have got will actually over time improve things. But it does come down to who's paying for these for the security guards, because as we know, if a security guard is paid to protect a block of a business block, then that's all he's going to protect.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's come to Stephen Gardner and pick up on this. Stephen, we've got a few questions, Simon Taylor being one of them, who's talking about the accountability issue, Stephen. And it's very clear in the public policing sector. But there is this sense in private security it's a bit fudged. But of course, in your staff and your operation is accountable in many different ways, isn't it? It's just less transparent and less obvious than it is for the public police. And the concern that they're not accountable is perhaps misplaced. Stephen?
For us, Martin, all of my officers are accountable to me, so let's start there. Secondly, we, as Chris quite rightly pointed out, we're performing a function for the clients who are deploying us. So we do have accountability. Most of, I would say 99% of my officers would be only too happy to work with the Daves and the Chris's of this world to turn around and say, we have an issue on site. We've discovered X, Y, and Z. Please come. We've done the investigation for you. This is what we've done. Now I think it's your turn to take that investigation further. What we need to do is we need to train our officers. I keep saying this, but we need to train our officers better to make them more professional, to give them that professionalism, and by working together with the relevant police force authority in the area where we work. I believe we can get better officers. The accountability issue will stem from that.
Okay, Philip, I'm going to come to you. You've obviously written quite a bit about this over the years in different ways about accountability. There is this sense, Philip, isn't there, that the private security sector is only accountable to those who pay, and because of that perception, it undermines the view that they could ever act in the public interest, despite your point, and I take it completely. There is a shared interest in some outputs. Philip, you're on mute. Your thoughts about this accountability issue?
Well, as you say, I've written quite a lot about this, and my argument is that actually, if you look closely at the accountability of private security, it is just as strong as the accountability of the public police. It's just different. Like the private security are accountable through law, through contract law, through tort law, through all kinds of areas of the law, and much easier actually to hold a private security person accountable to the law than it is to hold a public police officer accountable to the law in many countries. But I mean, I think this is why I think we need in government a ministry which is responsible for policing and not just the public police. That's why I suggested that legislation, police acts and private security acts should be replaced with policing acts which include provision for accountability of all policing providers through appropriate institutions. And this is exactly what as I said, what the Patten inquiry recommended in Northern Ireland. They recommended replacing the police board, which was the board through which the police were accountable, with a policing board through which all providers, and especially those funded through a policing budget, would be accountable. And I think that's the question: is private policing provision needs to be publicly accountable as well as accountable to the clients. Let's be honest about public police accountability. It's not all that it's cracked up to be honest. And it's good in countries like Britain and Canada and those kinds of countries. But in most countries in the world, I would suggest the public police are anything but publicly accountable. And even in countries like the UK, you try and get information about the public police from the public police, it's damned hard. because they'll always say, well, that's a matter which could compromise law enforcement, or, you know, this kind of thing. Holding the public police accountable has become much easier now because of technology. There's absolutely nothing the public police can do in public which somebody with a smartphone can't be photographing. And that's made a huge difference to the public accountability of the public police and of private security.
Exactly. Okay, thank you. I'm going to have David Dodge, if I can come to you for a very quick comment, Dave. You seem to have scared a lot of people with your stats about the situation in South Africa. A few questions here about professionalisation. Perhaps in the South African context, given the fact that, as Phillips perhaps says, it's not the same everywhere. So what's the key route there to making a change for the better on the big global scale? Would Phillips Stenning's idea of a policing minister talking about policing be the difference? Dave, very quickly, if you wouldn't mind, because we're running out of time.
I think, yes, I think that the policing idea would definitely work, but I think it's got to go beyond policing, actually. I think Phillips constrained himself a bit too much. I would go for the whole criminal justice system. And part of this is, if we're going to go for trials, we're talking about funding. A lot of people have said about funding. There should be an issue whereby if private companies are involved in policing security activities and there's a result from it through the criminal justice system, then is that possibly a model for funding their operations? You could certainly do it in fraud cases, and it's similar to the fact that you tax, where the tax solicitors get their costs, exactly the same can provide to private security.
Dave, thank you very much indeed. Well, we have inundated with questions, inundated with points. Thank you very much indeed to all of you. We've really running out of time. I'm going to ask each of my panel for just a closing statement, their closing few thoughts on what's the key thing we need to think about in a post-COVID-19 to bring about this change. Just if you wouldn't mind, 20 seconds each. Let me come to you first, Dave Dodge. Just 20 seconds if you wouldn't mind, Dave.
I think it's got to be a holistic approach. We've got to stop putting things in pigeonholes. We've got to everybody start working together. I said policing continuum, Phillips mentioned the policing, we've all mentioned professionalism. Somebody has to get a grip of the whole thing from start to finish.
Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Gardner, final statement please, just 20 seconds.
Private security delivers safety and security in a very commercial world. We look forward, as Dave correctly points out, we look forward to further collaboration with our policing partners, and in the belief that working together has to be for the betterment of the general public.
Thank you very much indeed. Nicely put. Chris Phillips, your final statement, please. Just 20 seconds if you wouldn't mind, Chris. We're running out of time.
Absolutely. Yeah. What we've got to recognise is that policing cannot keep up with the changes in crime. There's no way that it can, and legislation struggles to keep up with it as well. So we need to engage with our private sector colleagues, and we need to do that in a way that gives the public a decent service. That can only happen by professionalising the private security sector much more, to give them the extra skills they needed and give them the opportunity to take these people to court when they find wrongdoing.
Thank you very much indeed. Interesting point. And Professor Phillips Stenning, he's only right to ask you for the final statement on this webinar. Philip, your thoughts, please. Just 20 seconds, Philip, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I mean, I think the issue for me is that governments around the world need to take seriously their primary responsibility, which is to keep their citizens safe and secure. And for me, that means they need to totally rethink their responsibilities for policing and governing policing. And I've outlined some of the ways in which they could do that. And for me, that's the critical issue now.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Phillips. Thank you to all my panellists for their insightful views. Well, we could have continued. We could have gone on, I think, for another hour. The questions were flowing in. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions. You would have seen I did try to get your points into what was made. I hope the world listens to some of these points being made. This view that private security is not accountable is misplaced. This view that public policing can ever cope on its own is misplaced. This reality that around the world governments are missing a massive opportunity to serve citizens better. It seems strange to me we could ever have got to this situation. And as one of the offenders a couple of weeks ago, those who attend these panels regularly will know we had 2 ex-offenders. And what they were saying is they rely on a disjointed approach in order that they can commit crimes. Doesn't it seem a crazy world? So thank you very much indeed to our panel. Thank you for the audience. Just one thing, when we talk about good practice around the world, one thing we can do is look at those who are performing in a really good way and put them forward for an Oscar nomination. I'd ask each of you, wherever you are in the world, please just make one nomination in the US, in India, in the Benelux, in Kenya, Romania, Australia, Germany, and as from yesterday in the United Kingdom. Entries are open in the United Kingdom as from yesterday. Please just make one nomination. It's important we recognise those who are outstanding at what we do. And just before we came on air, Stephen Gardner says, I'm already on to it. And Dave Dodge was looking at South Africa. Thought leadership webinars, we'd hear every Tuesday and Thursday. On next Tuesday is what should we expect from security leaders? Are they doing enough? And we've got amongst our panel, Govrid Heinrichs, the worldwide president of ASIS International. We've got a corporate security manager coming on. And we're going to be asking them, you're supposed to be leading this. What's going on? We won't let them off the hook, as you know. Next Thursday, we're going to be talking about skills, another international panel. So wherever you are in the world, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I hope you'll be able to join us on Tuesday. The blog will be up later tomorrow. So will a copy of this recording. Until then, wherever you are in the world, stay safe.